and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Margaret, the Maid of Norway.
One day we will be remembered.
Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was born sometime between March 1st and April 9 of 1283. Her father was the 15-year-old King Eric II of Norway, and her mother was the oldest child and only daughter of King Alexander III of Scotland. Her mother, Margaret of Scotland, died just after her birth of complications from that birth, leaving her father a 15-year-old single dad. Luckily, he was the King of Norway, so he had a support staff to help him, but he was only 15, so he had no say in anything having to do with his daughter. She wasn't even in his custody. He was a child with a crown and a daughter. When her parents got married, Scotland and Norway made an agreement. The agreement stated that if the King of Scotland had no surviving sons, the children of the Scottish princess would inherit the Scottish throne. It also stated that her daughters could inherit the Norwegian throne if it is the custom. But the Scottish were likely tricked, because not only was it not the custom, it was straight up illegal, so that was never going to happen. Women could not legally rule Norway. The Scottish lawyers should have seen a red flag in the "if it is the custom" line, but they missed it. At the time of her birth, she had only one living uncle, the other one having died just a couple of years before. So after her grandfather and her uncle, she was next in line for the throne of Scotland. That is, until her uncle had children of his own. When Margaret was about 9 months old, her other uncle died, without children, making her the heir presumptive of her grandfather for Scotland. She was the only living descendant of the King of Scotland. King Alexander didn't waste time. He didn't even wait to see if his son's widow was pregnant. 8 days after the death of his last child, he gathered all 13 earls, 24 barons, and 3 clan chiefs to swear to recognize his granddaughter as heir to the throne of Scotland. It became even more important when 2 months later it was clear that the prince's widow was not pregnant. When the little Norwegian princess was about 2, her grandfather remarried. He was hoping to create more descendants, because there weren't many left. The king was found dead at the bottom of a cliff after a tragic accident just months into his marriage. He'd been trying to get home, in a storm, to his new bride for her birthday the next day. His horse likely lost footing, and they both fell to their death. But this widow was indeed pregnant. So all 3 countries waited to see how this would all shake out. There was a dispute in Scottish Parliament because the heir was an unborn baby, and the next in line was a 3-year-old Norwegian princess. There were arguments about who came after this unborn baby and the little princess, but also if the Norwegian princess should even be in line at all. John Balliol and Robert the Bruce both claimed to be next, and it seemed that Bruce did not include the Norwegian princess in his proposed succession line at all. Things got worse when Dowager Queen Yolande had a stillborn baby in November. Margaret was the next ruler of Scotland. Within months, King Eric II of Norway's most prominent counselor arrived in Scotland to claim the throne for the princess. The king is dead. Long live the queen. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was Margaret I of Scotland, but contested because Robert the Bruce raised a rebellion. No 3-year-old Norwegian princess was going to be his queen. The rebellion was shut down pretty quickly, but this left the 18-year-old King Eric reluctant to send his 3-year-old daughter to be queen of a far-off country that appeared to be politically unstable. He couldn't go with her, and her mother died when she was born, so Norway looked for an ally in England. King Eric sent envoys to King Edward I of England. The 2 countries talked about Margaret, who they called Lady and Queen, and Scotland was left out of the conversation completely. They had been left unread on the conversation about their own queen. When Norway and England made a decision, they invited the Scots to join. The Guardians of Scotland, along with Robert the Bruce, were invited to join the conversation about their queen. Finally, Margaret was not only the daughter of the King of Norway and the granddaughter of the last King of Scotland, she was also the grandniece of the King of England, being the granddaughter of his sister. They were all related. It was one huge family drama. The deal was made that Margaret would be sent to England no later than November 1st, 1290, when she would be 7.5. She would then be sent to Scotland when, and only when, the English king was convinced it was safe to do so. Edward I of England was also the one designated to pick her husband, with her father being allowed to veto any option. So King Edward picked his own son and heir, of course, Prince Edward, the future King Edward II of England, who was a year younger than Margaret, and her first cousin once removed. Her future husband was the cousin of her father. Age appropriate, I guess, but maybe don't marry cousins to each other. #the Habsburgs. If you've been with me since the beginning, Prince Edward is someone we've spoke about before. The literal beginning. Episode 1 of Season 1 was about Isabella of France, who married King Edward II. That is this very same Prince Edward, the future King Edward II. We have nearly reached the place in time where I started Season 1. And if you listen to my very first episode, you know that the person who Prince Edward eventually married was Isabella of France. So, what went down? I'm on it. I got you. The Scottish guardians and magnates were in favor of this choice for their consort, but they weren't really given much choice in the matter. They did not have veto rights, and her father, King Eric, didn't veto it either. Now this was a race of lawyers versus time. King Eric wouldn't send his daughter until all the contracts were agreed upon. They needed to figure out marriage contracts, dower contracts, succession contracts, and the possible union of England and Scotland, as the Queen of Scotland was marrying the future King of England. He was also the son of the man known as the Hammer of the Scots, so that was a little awkward, I'm sure. Their relationship status was firmly in the "it's complicated" camp. Not that they had any say in it, they were both very small children. By August, they had finally agreed that Scotland would remain independent from England. The countries would be run separately, and she was on her way to the island of Great Britain. The ship she sailed on was her father's ship, but he was unable to accompany her, being king himself. So she left Norway, presumably healthy, but became ill on the journey of either food poisoning or, less likely, motion sickness. They landed on Orkney, a Norwegian-controlled island off the coast of Scotland, where 7-year-old Margaret died the last week of September. The Scottish nobles, already having gathered for her crowning, were informed of her death. Her body was sent back to her father in Norway, who insisted that her coffin be opened so he could confirm her identity. He did, and she was then buried in Norway. Prince Edward would never marry her and needed a new bride. For his story, go back to the start of Season 1. Scotland had no more descendants of King Alexander, the only child with no living cousins. On top of that, remember William the Lion from the start of Season 2? Margaret was the last legitimate descendant of him as well. So Scotland was in a succession crisis, and no one knew who would be next. They would have to go way back in the family tree to figure this out. It was going to take some family tree deciphering gymnastics to figure out who was next in line. And that is where we will leave it for now. What would Scotland do? I'll get into that, but for now, no one knew. We'll get into that spider web soon. It might get complicated. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or at Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Smash that like button, subscribe or follow so more people can find us. And don't forget, share with friends or frenemies alike. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.